more back in stock, and if you're interested, come and get it there. So I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming, and I'd like to repeat the apology for being late. My brief has been to talk for 15 minutes and then we'll have a conversation. And it will be a bit of a challenge for me to keep it down to 15 minutes, I have to say. So do interrupt me if I start going on. As Amy said, I'm a philosopher and not a physicist, and I've written biographies previously of philosophers. I wrote a biography of Ludwig Wittgenstein, the Austrian philosopher, and Bertrand Russell, the British philosopher. So why should I, a philosopher, write a biography of Robert Oppenheimer, a physicist? Well, the origin for that was I was asked by the Observer newspaper to review a collection of Oppenheimer's correspondence. Some of you may know this collection. It's edited by Kimball Smith and Wiener. And before I reviewed this collection of correspondence, I guess I knew about Oppenheimer what everybody knows, that he directed the Los Alamos laboratory that made the first atom bomb, that he then got involved in politics, that he had his security clearance taken away from him. So that's more or less all I knew about Oppenheimer. I didn't know that he wrote poetry. I didn't know that his interest in Hindu literature and the Hindu tradition was not a dilettante thing, that he taught himself Sanskrit in order to read the Hindu scriptures in their original language. I didn't know that he wrote short stories on the model of Catherine Mansfield, and I didn't know what an extraordinarily complicated, complex and fascinating person he was. So I said in this review that there's a really great biography to be written of Oppenheimer that would try to explain his physics, but would also try to incorporate all these other facets of his life, not his interest in Hinduism, his complicated emotional life, and also his political engagements, which were terribly important, not just for him, but for the whole world. And then people got in touch with me and said, well, why don't you try and do it? And eventually I did, having persuaded my friend James Dodd, who is a theoretical physicist, to help me with the physics. So my aim then was to try and get across the multifaceted and endlessly fascinating character of Oppenheimer. It took me 11 years to write the book, and never once in those 11 years did I ever become bored of Oppenheimer. There's always something new to discover. There was always some enigma to puzzle through about Oppenheimer. He was a curious mixture. One of his closest friends was Isidore Rabi, the physicist who was based in New York for much of his life. And Rabi said about Oppenheimer that he never really cohered into a single person. He said, Rabi said about Oppenheimer, I understood his problem. His problem was identity. His problem was, he said, that when you got to know Oppenheimer, you saw bright shining splinters, which never quite came together in a coherent whole. And so the challenge of the biographer, really, my challenge was to do my best to show that these bright shining splinters actually did form a coherent whole. And it was a bit of a challenge because he is an elusive character. And I think Rabi was absolutely right that identity was, as it were, Oppenheimer's persisting and characteristic problem. And this goes right back, I think, to his upbringing. I became very fascinated by his upbringing in New York. He was part of a German Jewish community based in the Upper West Side of Manhattan. And I guess that whole community had, in some sense, an identity problem, because it's the basis for the coherence of the community was, on the one hand, that they were German and Jewish, and on the other hand, that they wanted very much, they came to America in order to integrate with American society. Oppenheimer was known by his teachers, by his university lecturers, and so on as a German Jew, but he never considered himself either German or Jewish. And so that gives you some idea of, right at the heart of Oppenheimer, there is a sort of elusive quality to how he might be characterized. As opposed to Rabi. Rabi came from the, as it were, the third wave of Jewish immigration. If you think of three waves of Jewish immigration, you have the Sephardic Jews from Spain and Portugal who came to America in the 17th century because they were exiled from Spain and Portugal. And they never numbered more than tens of thousands. Then in the 19th century, you had German Jews who were escaping prejudice and wanting to start a new life in America. And by the end of the 19th century, they numbered hundreds of thousands. Then you had the third wave of Jewish immigration, which came from Russia and Poland, and they were fleeing for their lives. And when they arrived in New York, they wanted to preserve their identity, whereas a lot of the German Jews came to New York in order to find a new identity. Well, the Eastern Jews outnumbered the Germans by the German Jews there were hundreds of thousands. The Eastern Jews, by 1922, it's estimated there were 2.5 million Polish and Russian Jews in the United States. Rabi came from that wave of Jewish immigration. And Rabi said about Oppenheimer that a key fact about him was that he couldn't do what Rabi could do, which was look at a synagogue and the people going in and singing at the synagogue, and even though he had no religious faith, Rabi said he could say, "These are my people." Oppenheimer could never do that. And Rabi thought that was at the heart of why Oppenheimer developed such an intense interest in the Hindu tradition, because he wanted, as it were, to look on the one hand at things as an integrated whole, on the other hand, in some sense, to preserve the mystery of life and the mystery of the world. So Oppenheimer came out of this German. How long do I have left?
Keep going.
So Oppenheimer came out of this German Jewish tradition. As I say, not regarding himself either as German or Jewish, but he went to the ethical culture school, which I think had a profound influence on the way he looked at himself and his obligations to society. The Ethical Culture Society, it's a very New York thing. It was started by a man called Felix Adler, whose father had been a rabbi, and Felix Adler was supposed to himself become a rabbi, but he lost his faith in the religious aspects of the Jewish religion, but maintained his commitment to the non-religious aspects of the Jewish tradition, which is what the Ethical Culture Society is all about. It's trying to preserve the ethical part of the Judaic tradition while abandoning any specific belief in anything non-scientific or supernatural. And this society had a great following among the German Jewish community in the Upper West Side of Manhattan, including Oppenheimer's parents, who was leading figures in the Ethical Society. And they sent Oppenheimer to the Ethical Culture School, where he was trained in this tradition, a religion of deed rather than creed, is how Felix Adler put it. That the point of ethical culture was to become aware of your obligations to your fellow man and woman, and to take on board the duties that you have as a citizen. And I think the ethos of the Ethical Culture Society and the Ethical Culture School stayed with Oppenheimer for most of his life. He didn't make many friends at the school. He was rather an odd child, Oppenheimer, very intellectually precocious, but unable really to socialize very easily. One of his schoolmates remembers Oppenheimer at the age of 8 saying to her, "Ask me a question in Latin and I'll reply in Greek. Which is enormously impressive for an 8-year-old, but not the way to make friends at school. And so he had this reputation for being slightly awkward, slightly gauche, but intellectually precocious. He was bound for Harvard, of course, as a lot of people from the ethical culture school were, but he became ill just before he was due to take up a place to study chemistry, predominantly at Harvard. But he got ill, and in order to recuperate, he came to New Mexico, because his closest friend, and more or less the only friend he made at the ethical culture school, strikingly, was not part of the Manhattan German Jewish Society. He was a man called Ferguson, who came from Albuquerque and invited Oppenheimer to New Mexico. So in the summer of 1922, Oppenheimer left New York City, came to New Mexico, and absolutely adored it. He learned to ride horses here. He traveled the length and breadth of the Pecos Mountains and the Jemez Mountains. And of course that stayed with him, as we all know, when Groves said, well, where should we put the laboratory? Oppenheimer remembered his deep and abiding love of New Mexico. So that happened in the summer of 1922. He got to know people here. He had his first love affair here with a woman called Catherine Chavez, who came from a very exotic sort of Hidalgo family in the Pecos Valley. And then he went to Harvard. Now, the extraordinary thing about Oppenheimer at Harvard is that he went there to study chemistry. Within a year, he decided that the really interesting work was being done in physics, and he made an application to attend graduate level. Remember, he's only just finished his freshman year. He made an application to study graduate level physics courses at Harvard. And they called him for an interview, and they asked what he'd read, and he gave them a list of what he'd read, which was an extraordinarily impressive list, not just because it was all the cutting-edge work in, as it were, old quantum theory, but also because it mixed works in German, French, English, and so on. And so he was able to take these courses. And he always said that this influenced his approach to physics, because he, as it were, went in at the deep end. He started doing graduate level courses, and in his second year at Harvard, he was, absorbing the very latest cutting edge research, but he hadn't actually had the groundwork, which is, one of the things that is often commented about Oppenheimer as a physicist, that is, he often made mistakes in his mathematics. And he attributed that to the fact that he hadn't had a conventional scientific upbringing. He'd gone straight from first year chemistry to graduate level physics without doing the usual route from one to the other. However, he excelled, of course, at Harvard. He then went to Cambridge, England. It's very odd that he chose Cambridge, England, because the leading figure there was not a theoretical physicist, and it's theoretical physics that Oppenheimer was mainly interested in. The leading figure at Cambridge was, of course, Rutherford, who was famous for his laboratory, and Oppenheimer already at that age had a reputation for being a disaster in a laboratory. I'll come to this in a moment, but his appointment to the head of the laboratory here is one of the most extraordinary aspects of 20th century history, I think. Anyway, very, very quickly to recap. So he went to Cambridge. He had a horrible time at Cambridge. He didn't like British people. He didn't like British society. They thought he was mad. And so he went to Germany, where exactly the opposite happened. He acquired a reputation for being brilliant and quickly started publishing papers, high-level papers, and that got him a reputation as one of the young whiz-kid physicists in this new branch of quantum mechanics, which was then being developed. And he came over to the States. He had this peculiar appointment where he spent half the year at Berkeley and the other half at Pasadena at Caltech. And he specifically wanted that because, on the one hand, Caltech already had a reputation of having established people who were who were doing fundamentally important work, and he wanted to be there for that. But he also wanted to be in Berkeley precisely for the opposite reason, because he said that there was not much going on at Berkeley, and at Berkeley he could create a physics department, as it were, in his own image, which is what he proceeded to do, together with his friend Ernest Lawrence, who was a laboratory physicist, and together Oppenheimer and Lawrence made Berkeley, of course, one of the foremost physics departments in the world. Now, we think of Oppenheimer as being politically engaged, but this was a relatively late development, actually, in Oppenheimer's life. Ernest Lawrence has recorded that he was astonished that in 1930 he was talking to Oppenheimer about politics. Oppenheimer had never heard of the Great Crash of '29. He didn't read newspapers, he didn't show any interest in politics. What got him interested in politics was actually the plight of his students during the Depression. He discovered to his horror that his students, even the most brilliant ones, were not getting top-level jobs. They were getting basic income jobs and were having a very hard time. And that got Oppenheimer interested in politics. They themselves, a lot of them were members of the Communist Party. He started attending parties and functions of the Communist Party. There's no evidence that he ever actually joined the Communist Party, as his brother Frank did. His brother Frank had his Communist Party card and so on. There is no, as far as anyone knows, Communist Party card with Oppenheimer's name on it. But as he himself said, he joined every Communist Front organisation on the west coast of America. And he was a well-known figure in radical left-wing circles. But you have to remember, I think, that in the 30s, and now we're in the mid-30s, 35, 36, the time of the Spanish Civil War, at that time there was no great shame attached to associating with radical left-wing activists. It wasn't considered by most people to be unpatriotic or dangerous or anything of that sort, with some exceptions. And those exceptions include J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, who, as soon as he noticed that Oppenheimer started appearing at meetings of radical left-wing activists, started following Oppenheimer. One of the most interesting aspects of my research on Oppenheimer was I spent ages at Washington, D.C. Oppenheimer left all his papers, and I think we're talking about 296 boxes of papers that he left at the Library of Congress. But also at the Library of Congress, one can get access to the FBI file on Oppenheimer, and it is absolutely huge. From the mid-30s onwards, Oppenheimer was followed everywhere by FBI agents. His house was bugged, his office was bugged, and then when he came to Los Alamos, of course, he had, on top of FBI, he had army security people recording everything he said, which was then fed into the file. And so the FBI file is absolutely enormous, recording almost, day by day where he went, who he spoke to, what he said on the telephone, and so on. And this was all transcribed. There's one thing I remember. There's a conversation between him and his wife Kitty, which is all transcribed, and there's a noise on the line, and Kitty said, "What's that?" And Oppenheimer said, "Oh, that'll be the FBI hanging up." He was very well aware that he was being under close surveillance. Okay, so he becomes active politically. Now, here's the thing. When fission was discovered in '39, he became very excited about its possibility for explosives. And there are stories of him making drawings on his blackboard of how a bomb could possibly work, and he was very excited about experiments to determine the critical mass of enriched uranium. Bohr and Wheeler had made their breakthrough, which was that it was no good. You couldn't expect to make an explosive using common uranium. You had to use uranium-235. All of that was understood and disseminated among scientists. very quickly in 1939. Now, when a committee was appointed in America to look into the possibility of actually using this knowledge of the extraordinary, explosive, potentially explosive energy to be released from the fission process, Groves went round meeting all the well-known scientists, and by that stage America had some pretty eminent Nobel Prize winning scientists, Compton, Ernest Lawrence, and so on. But Groves chose Oppenheimer to lead the project. And this, as I said before, is one of the great mysteries of the whole story. Why?